Everyone knows the story of Castlevania and Simon Belmont's singular quest to hunt down and take down the forces of Dracula, and therefore save humanity from his reign of terror. He was the first vampire hunter with his demon-slaying whip, or was he? Today, let's take a look back at the Castlevania series, the lore of each of the main players, and their importance in the timeline, and the games that made them famous. Castlevania, like many video games, actually got most of its backstory far later in its life than its first couple of games. The series' history actually starts with Leon Belmont in Lament of Innocence. Leon Belmont was born in the 11th century Europe, where knights not only protected their lords, but the peace of the entire kingdom as well from heretics. Leon joined the knighthood when he was 16, quickly becoming a soldier and joining a platoon with his close friend, Matthias Corvus. They made a platoon invincible with their skill in combat and strategy. After a particularly long campaign, Matthias would come back to find his wife had died of an illness while he was gone. He was so grief-stricken that he could barely get himself out of bed, and Leon was left to continue the campaigns on his own. Leon would later have his own brush with tragedy when his wife was kidnapped. Matthias would tell him it was a vampire that had captured his beloved and had taken her to a castle east of where they resided. The church, however, forbade him from pursuing Leon, and he felt he had no choice but to renounce his oath and go out in search of his wife. On his journey to the castle, Leon would run into an unexpected ally in Rinaldo Grifaldi, an alchemist that lived alone in the forest. It was from him that Leon would learn the vampire's name who had kidnapped his wife, Walter Bernard, who was well known for amusing himself with a cat and mouse game, where he would toy with powerful warriors before defeating them. Rinaldo offered his assistance by giving Leon the Whip of Alchemy, a weapon imbued with the powers of alchemy. He also gave him a gauntlet with the ability to absorb magical attacks, and sending him on his way with a warning that he would only be able to reach Walter after he had defeated his lieutenants. Leon remained undaunted and made his way to the castle, confronting and defeating each one of the lieutenants, eventually confronting Walter himself, discovering only then that his whip was incomplete, leaving him unable to harm the vampire. He hurriedly grabbed his wife, who now looked to be in a trance, and retreated to Rinaldo's abode once again, where he learned his wife had been bitten by Walter. The only way to save her was to kill Walter himself. Leon was beside himself. He knew he didn't have the tools to do what was needed to save his wife. On top of that, Rinaldo informed him that the only way to destroy Walter was to absorb his wife's soul into the whip. Leon was hesitant. He knew his wife was turning, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Sarah, however, had overheard the entire thing and volunteered to sacrifice herself to complete the weapon so her husband could defeat Walter and stop his reign of terror. Leon would eventually relent, bound her soul to the whip, transforming it into the legendary vampire killer that's been passed down through the Belmont line ever since. Leon steeled his resolve after burying his wife and confronted Walter once again, this time managing to shatter the ebony stone that protected him. But when he was about to strike the final blow, death appeared and absorbed Walter's soul into the Crimson Stone. It was then that Matthias appeared holding the stone. He had been behind this the whole time, prompting the confrontation between Leon and Walter, knowing Leon would find a way to defeat him. He had hatched this plan to get revenge on God and life itself for taking his wife. He would become immortal, eternal. He would become Dracula. He offered to make Leon a vampire as well, but Leon refused, intending to keep his promise to his wife Sarah. This enraged the newly born Dracula. Knowing he didn't have enough power to defeat Leon right now, he left him to death. Upon defeating Death himself, Leon told Death to give Matthias a message. The Belmonts would find a way to destroy him someday. Thus began the line of legendary vampire hunters known as the Belmonts, hunting Dracula through the ages. Their only purpose? End his existence and the tyranny he's brought upon this world. Ironically, all this would be unknown to fans of the games until the PS2, as this was the story of Lament of Innocence, one of the latest games in the Castlevania line chronologically, intended as an origin story of the entire family. There's a rather large gap as well between this game and the late 1400s. This is where the timeline gets a bit fuzzy, you see. There's this official timeline that records Trevor Belmont being the protagonist of Castlevania 3, released in 1989. And then there's Sonia Belmont, the lead protagonist of the Castlevania Legends series, released in 1997. While no longer quite canon, the story of Sonia Belmont is a fascinating one. She was originally introduced as the originator of the Belmont clan. Her story goes like this. One night, when she was 17, she met a young man named Alucard, who was hunting for his father whom he had never met. The two formed a bond together, but unfortunately would soon be separated as tragedy struck. The mansion where Sonia was raised was attacked by monsters serving Dracula. When she arrived, her grandfather was mortally wounded. Before dying, he explained to her that it was time for her power to be unleashed. Sonia took up her grandfather's whip as a memento and headed out to Dracula's castle. Each minion of Dracula that she slayed gave her unique powers that enhanced her combat skills significantly. Sonia would eventually reach the castle keep, not to be met by Dracula, but by Alucard, who expressed his surprise at her appearance and tried to convince her to leave. She stated that she was granted these powers to fight Dracula's demonic influence. Far from convinced, Alucard challenged her to a duel. Upon her defeat of Alucard, he sealed himself away in a coffin to heal, with Sonia swearing that she would never forget him. It was then that the ground suddenly crumbled beneath her, and she was confronted by Dracula himself, offered her a place at his side. She refused, stating that her powers were meant to protect. After a long, drawn-out battle, Sonia was victorious. Dracula perished with a warning that he would be back so long as there were humans. She promised that when that moment came, someone would appear to take her place. Sometime later, Sonia would have a child that resulted from her relationship with Alucard. This child would be called Trevor Belmont. As you can see, this timeline is quite a bit different than the one from Lament of Innocence, would pretty much make it null and void. And it was canon, until Koji Iragashi came in and said that the game didn't really fit inside the timeline and would now no longer be canon. Many think he rejected Sonia because she was female. Others think it was because the story didn't make sense with the rest of the timeline. For example, if Alucard was confident in her abilities, why would he be running around in 1476 looking for people to deal with his father in the events of Castlevania 3? Why would Trevor not exhibit any vampiric powers if he was the child of Sonia and Alucard? How would a vampire of an undead being father a child in the first place? It was more likely that all those reasons were more the reason why he felt that she didn't quite fit in the timeline, rather than him not liking the idea of a female lead. Ironically, Sonia was going to show up in another game, Castlevania Resurrection, which failed to get much traction due to disagreements between Konami of America and Konami of Japan, along with the early death of the Dreamcast due to the arrival of the PlayStation 2. Trevor Belmont, the lead protagonist of Castlevania 3, and at the time, the first known Belmont. However, he is still canon unlike Sonia. His story takes place in 1476, when people became disturbed by monsters that were commanded by a mysterious count in black known only as Dracula. The Eastern Orthodox Church would send out troops to subdue the monsters in secret, dispatch another team to deal with Dracula himself. After receiving no word for a time, they were presumed dead, and the church reluctantly reached out to the Belmont family for help. Trevor stepped forward to end the oppression. They reluctantly agreed. See, the Belmont clan, and Trevor in particular, were feared by many at the time because of his powers, and therefore the Belmont clan at its time lived outside of normal society. Trevor began his journey, slowly over time gaining allies along the way. At first there would be Grant Dynasty, who'd been turned into a demon by Dracula, and then placed in a clock tower to act as a guard for him. After his defeat at the hands of Trevor, returned to his human form, and agreed to accompany him on his quest to defeat Dracula. The next would be Sif Belnades. She was actually part of the first failed hunting party, was captured by Cyclops and turned to stone. After Trevor defeated the Cyclops, Sif was freed and agreed to come along on his quest as well. The last companion was Alucard himself, whom he finds looking for companions strong enough to defeat his father after he had decided that he disagreed with his actions. He meets Trevor and promptly challenges him to a duel. Once he's satisfied that Trevor can handle the job, he joins him as well. The four eventually make their way to Dracula's throne room, where Trevor is able to defeat Dracula with the vampire killer in his first encounter with the legendary Lord of the Night himself. The Belmont clan from this point on would be a well-known and respected family in the region. Trevor, however, still felt very uneasy and continued to investigate for signs of Dracula. 3 years into this investigation, Trevor began to hear rumors of a servant that had betrayed Dracula during the war 3 years prior. He originally met Hector, but after a conversation, he realized that this wasn't the forge master that he was looking for, and the two parted ways amicably. He would eventually run into Isaac, who turned out to be just the person he was looking for. The two fought viciously, with Isaac finally managing to cut Trevor, claiming that that's all he needed as he ran off into the night. Trevor pursued to finish him off, eventually running into Hector again as he had tracked down Isaac to a now abandoned castle. He found the seal to a hidden chamber that had been unlocked and realized quickly that it was Isaac that had used Trevor's own blood to unlock it. Trevor, being too weary and too wounded at this point to really press on, decides he should test Hector and see if he's capable of handling Isaac, or if he has to try to struggle on his own. After battling Hector, he decides that he's grown enough and tells him to show no mercy towards Isaac. While Hector is battling his way there, Trevor senses an enormous surge of power, sees Dracula's castle rise from the ground, once more only to be stabbed in the back by Isaac. Isaac explains that it was Hector's magic that broke the seal on Dracula's castle, that by using demonic magic to fight the guardian within, he had awoken the castle. He then pulls his spear out of Trevor and leaves him to die. Trevor, however, is saved by Julia Lafrose, a witch who had been aiding Hector this whole time in many of his travels. Trevor would then return to his wife to continue on the Belmont bloodline. I find it odd that after so many years of hunting down Dracula, that he would just stop and basically retire without knowing for sure if Dracula was dealt with, especially after having seen his castle rise again. But I could not find any more on it. I can only assume that even though he recovered from his injuries, it left him in no shape to continue the fight. The next major Belmont of note is named Christopher, and he was the main protagonist of the first two Game Boy games released, known as Castlevania Adventure and Castlevania II Belmont's Revenge. Almost 100 years have passed since Trevor's era. Yet again, Dracula has risen, this time up to Christopher to see to it that Dracula goes down, this time for good. He makes his way to Dracula's castle, defeating all of his lieutenants and striking him down for good. Or at least he thinks so. Dracula manages to narrowly escape his mist and bides his time. 15 years pass, just as Christopher's son, Soel, was coming of age to take over as bearer of the vampire killer. It's then that his son disappears, and 4 castles arise in the distance. Christopher goes to investigate these castles, takes down their guardians. As he does, Dracula's castle suddenly rises from the ground. Christopher presses on, finding his son is now controlled by the will of Dracula. Unable to reason with him, the two fight, with Christopher emerging triumphant, eventually managing to free his son from Dracula's influence as well. It's then that he finds out that Dracula used the spirits of slain guardians in the castles to resurrect himself. Christopher then presses on, confronting and defeating Dracula, again for now. Christopher is most well known for being the first Belmont to be able to shoot fireballs from the vampire killer, and shares a name with Christopher Lee, who was very famous for his portrayal of Count Dracula in many horror films. Despite very little being known about him, and his apparent unpopularity among the fanbase, he is chronologically the first Belmont not only to beat Dracula twice, but to have done it alone. And he's also the oldest of the family line to have defeated him. Another thing of note is that according to the Japanese instruction manual, he was responsible for severing Medusa's head and sealing Dracula in the keep called the Carpathian Tower. Now comes Simon Belmont, arguably the most well-known of the Belmont family, as his was the very first appearance in the very first Castlevania game, and its debatably popular sequel Simon's Quest. Simon grew up hearing stories of his family's legacy, and often wondered how worthy he was of that legacy. However, he would get his chance, because at the age of 22, in the year 1691, on Easter Sunday, 100 years after Dracula was defeated by Christopher, Dracula had returned, having been reawakened by a dark order of humans on Easter Day during a dark mass in an abandoned monastery. Simon was determined to end this threat and this new reign of terror, entering boldly into Dracula's castle alone to face the Count, eventually making his way through his lieutenants and facing Dracula himself, defeating him, but at a great cost. Dracula had almost fatally wounded him during the battle. 7 years would pass, and Simon felt that he was close to death due to his encounter with Dracula, only to have a mysterious woman appear to him in the morning mist. She explained that he had been cursed by Dracula, and the only way to save himself was to gather Dracula's remains and burn them in his castle. This was the only way he'd be able to save himself from death. Simon resolved to take up this quest, not only to save himself, but the land that he called home, which had once again become infested with monsters, so much so that the villagers would board up their houses at night and hide from the creatures that would take over their fair town. Many of the townfolk were conflicted over Simon's mission, some helping him out of gratitude, and others deliberately misleading him out of fear that what he was doing would hasten Dracula's return. Simon, however, persevered, eventually managing to gather all of Dracula's remains, resurrecting him once again, finally managing to defeat the Count. He then burned his remains and buried them in a graveyard, his bravery earning him the gratitude of those around him, and eventually a village would form around his family home. That would be where Just Belmont would later grow up. Well, that's it for part 1 of this particular series, where I'm going through the timeline of the various different Castlevania games to figure out where all the major plays are and where they actually fit in the official timeline of the game series. Hopefully you guys are enjoying this so far, and you'll come back and check out the second and potentially third one, depending on how long these turn out to be. I'm struggling to keep these under 20 minutes or so, so they're probably going to be split up pretty significantly so I can cover the whole thing. But if you like what you saw, please go ahead and give the video a like. If you see more of my content you like, please consider hitting the subscribe button and the notify bell, that way you know when I post new content. But until next time, happy gaming!